All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for sticking around. As mentioned, my name is Jocelyn Aguilera, and as a second-year grad student at Cal State Long Beach, I focus on women of color in social movements and subcultures. I also teach history at John C. Fremont High School in South Central, so I work on decolonizing curricula. I'm a part of a local LA Chicana punk band called Ella. I compose music as a tool of activism, and I'm a core organizer for the girls and gender expansive rock camp called Chiquettes Rockets. So my research is titled, We Don't Need the English, Transforming and Reconstructing Punk Politics into Chicana Punk Social Activism 1977 to 1989. Okay, so I'm going to begin by showing a quick video. So feel free to interact with this video or have your personal mosh pit at home. This is a webinar, so I cannot see anyone. So it is okay. This is no judgment here.
And get ready. No, no, no means no.
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 No, 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 no.
No, 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 no,
No, no, no means no. No means no. No means no. No means no. No means no.
All right. So the short video you just watched was the Alice Bag Band performing at the unveiling of Dolores Huerta Square in East LA. So this unveiling event happened last year on June 23rd, so right before quarantine. And as one of the performers of this event lineup, I witnessed all these amazing punk performing acts. And we were honoring and celebrating Dolores Huerta, who co-founded the United Farm Workers, has coined the phrase "Si se puede," and just overall has accomplished so much as an activist for our communities. So the significance of this unveiling brings attention to the often overlooked civil rights leader. And although I feel that Dolores needs so much more than a square in her name, a plaza, what I learned was that Alice Bag, the performer you just saw, along with other folks, pushed and organized, leading to an East Los Angeles plaza being named in honor of Dolores Huerta. So in other words, punk made this happen. So this made me very interested in researching more about social activism, but facilitated by Chicana ponqueras. And overall, how and why Mexican American women became part of this punk subculture. So I decided to start with the beginning of punk in Los Angeles. So ultimately, I pieced together this argument that although initially punk was a British subculture, as it migrated, the Chicana ponqueras of Los Angeles redefined punk in their own image and produced a network of solidarities connecting social activism from local and global communities to advocate for social injustices through punk music and punk shows. And we see this transformation of punk since the beginning of punk in Los Angeles. It emerged first in the Hollywood scene, very small scene, and punk emerged with diversity already. It began with women, it began with queer folks, and it began with people of color. So having these intersecting identities, for example, being a Mexican American woman, Chicana Ponquera's identities and politics created a connecting center where these experiences reconstructed the punk scene. So in doing so, punk became this kind of avenue where Chicanas reimagined themselves as empowered subjects, but to positively change society. And at the same time, when they were doing this, they were expanding punk periphery through local and global interactions. So in my research, I focused on a couple of Chicana punks in the 1970s and 1980s, but today I'm going to be mainly focusing on Alicia Armendariz Velasquez, aka Alice Bag. So Bag's identities and politics naturally established a different sense of social activism, and it reflected these issues of race and gender in the East Los Angeles and Hollywood punk scene. She was from East LA, but she moved around going into the Hollywood punk scene initially. So as a lot of East Los Angeles and Hollywood punk bands evoke this aggressive music, trying to get over this status quo, these lyrics aimed at political issues, what Chicana Ponqueras brought to the mix was this shift and this uniqueness of music to reveal these commitments towards social issues shaped by their own experiences. So as Alice Bag was growing up during the 1960s and 70s, a lot of her life experiences shaped her into moving into the punk scene. And she experienced a lot of things, a lot of marginalizations of being a woman of color. Attending school in East LA, she noticed that East LA schools lacked resources for students of color and denied a multicultural curriculum, and it was permitting these racist overtones. And rather than teaching critical thinking skills, students learned obedience and memorization. So as she went through this school system, and she was inspired by her personal experiences in the school system, and as well as the surrounding issues that was going on in East LA, in her song Programmed, Alice Bag describes how the teaching of obedience and memorization in school disenfranchised the Mexican American community. The school system at that time became a vessel to erase culture and assimilate Mexican American youth. And she expresses this in her lyrics. She says, "I memorized what the teachers said. No one ever asked me what was in my head. Their values and their histories were deposited in me. Education be damned, we are being programmed. I shine a light that's not reflected," because I've got my own perspective. So Alice Bag opposed this flawed educational system happening as she grew up in the late 1960s and 70s. But she did encourage becoming an educated person of color. She reveals this unbalance of education structure and the institutionalized racism in that structure while using punk as an amplifier to these social issues. So in other words, education reform for Mexican American youth became a big thing and a big theme in Chicana Ponquera music at the time. So culture identity constructed a new lens for Chicana Ponqueras. It constructed a new lens for Alice Bag to tackle these issues pertaining to her culture identity. And we saw this in the punk movement as it was brewing. So now as Chicanas expanded the periphery of punk through intersectionality, and they used this, they were advocating for marginalized communities, their own communities, also gender issues. And some of them felt that the Chicano movement happening was sexist. Others of them did not feel representative in the women's liberation movement. So punk for them became kind of like this alternative to the social bigger movements happening around them. And so punk identities and politics allowed for this transnational dimension connecting the struggles in South American countries with culture. So the Chicana identity emerged as the transnational Latinx identity, where culture became this unifying factor or a connecting center to other countries such as Mexico, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. So the meeting of this intersection of Ponquera identity with transnational activism had its highest moment in the early 1980s. And it started with the civil war between Marxist-Leninist group called the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, known as the FMLN, and the government of El Salvador. So with the Salvadorian government failing to improve the living standards of the country, the lower class in El Salvador organized, and many of them formed the FMLN. And this rebel group pursued equality among social classes through communism while seeking support from Nicaraguan governments, Cuban governments, Soviet governments. And if we're thinking about context and we're thinking about containment and Cold War, we see the US being involved in political affairs and foreign affairs. So as the official civil war began, the United States began to aid the Salvadorian government as preventative measures to contain communist views of the FMLN, of course, in the name of liberty and democracy. And as Chicanas faced their own injustices of race, of gender, and class in the United States, the hypocrisy of liberation and democracy by their own country was kind of puzzling. And in fact, many of them aligned with FMLN. So the flyer you see here, titled A Concert for a Revolution, this is where Chicana punks began to organize and play benefit concerts. And this kind of encompasses Chicana punks' identities, politics, and social activism, and their connections to these global conflicts. So we see here, there's a woman with her fist up. This is a Salvadorian revolutionary woman covering her face with a bandana. We see two men, and we see the lineup, the Plugs, which is an East LA band, the Alice Bag Band, Frank and Bent. And this is a benefit for Crispies. It is committee in solidarity with the people of El Salvador with a $5 donation. So although seems like a very DIY simple flyer, the choice of selecting such images reflect the cultural and feminist politics of Chicana Ponqueras. The revolutionary woman at the forefront symbolizes the strength of women of color in creating this positive change. It expressed this solidarity with the Salvadorian working class while allowing a transnational connection through punk social activism. So because of cultural identity, because Chicanas have a type of cultural connection to folks in Latin America and South America, this kind of broadened up their perspectives and bringing in these perspectives of social injustices occurring globally into the punk scene. Additionally to the benefit concert, and there was many benefit concerts that Chicana Ponqueras put together to help just other causes globally, not just in the US or not just locally in Los Angeles. Chicana punk fashion generated a material form of solidarity. So this image here of Alicia performing at Hollywood Club's Lingerie in 1984. When I first saw this, I was very drawn to this pose. I just love how she has her eyes closed, her mouth is wide open, and this is definitely capturing the spirit of punk performance. She has these large, shiny jewelry, heavy dark makeup, and just her confidence and punk attitude translates through this image. However, what I find very interesting, and maybe some of you might not notice or did already notice, is this pin here on her right shoulder. And this small detail that perhaps most viewers dismissed is a pin displaying FMLN with a drawing of party leader Farabundo Martin. So Alice Bag was a supporter of this Marxist-Leninist group, and it uncovers more about Chicanas and Chicana punk identities and their connections to global affairs. Although a very small detail in her attire, she purposefully chose an issue to emphasize, and this is through fashion. Becoming not becoming difficult not to notice during a performance, this small ornament did challenge US foreign policy and created support for FMLN, and it inserted her into transnational occurrences. Yet it wasn't through political campaigning or music, but through style. So she's embodying and self-fashioning revolution and very small details, but as a performer, as the front woman of the bags, and many other groups she had and continues to have, she has embodied this transnational, expanding this punk subculture, not just something small that no one knows about, but these global situations happening. So in sum, the undeniable and influential presence of Chicana punk reveals a more complex story of the Los Angeles punk scene. Their perspectives offer new lenses that go beyond an initial British subculture, but at the same time complicates the narratives of Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx history. The international and transformations in other countries, and this happening in local communities reflect how outside events does impact other events, and how outside events shape the punk scene, as well as how punk participants reshape outside subcultures. Chicanas in punk contributed to the visibility of women and Chicanx subculture and culture through their music and their social activism. Their work in the punk scenes contribute to an understanding of how intersection of race, class, and gender reconfigures subcultural movements. So Chicana Ponqueras in the 1970s and 80s used this marginalization in the dominant culture to reshape their roles in the subculture and become this connecting center. They expanded punk periphery. They expanded into the local issues to the global interactions, and they have paved the way for future women in punk. Through the adaptation of social activism as a core ideology. So punk for many Chicanas in present day means becoming a positive change. So in the end, Chicanx punk is deeper than just style or listening to music. It's about fighting injustices and taking direct action. So thank you, and I'll be answering questions now.
Thank you, Jocelyn. There is a comment and a question in the chat. I'll read off the comment first. One of our board members comments, if you had told me 40 years ago that grad students would one day be doing scholarly papers on punk rock, I would have thought you were high.
And I had that conversation with Richard too, because he mentioned that his wife and himself participated in that punk subculture, and they just were being kids and having fun. But it just shows that what we do is all historic and it's part of history. So thank you for that, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been a couple wrestling venues from the East Side, Lucha Underground and Lucha Vavoom. And music is a big part of professional wrestling. Were there any connections between Chicana punk and those venues?
So Chicana punk usually most bands, we call it, we're always down to play anything for the cause. So in other words, there was some instances where Chicana punk bands or just punk bands in general would play in certain venues that had the luchadores. There's a place called La Plaza de la Raza that used to have community organized events, and punk bands would perform for that. There was events where CSUN and Cal State LA would have events and they would invite punk bands. So it's very interesting because punk was always invited to all these events when it came to talking about social justice.
Well, there are a number of positive comments there, so I hope you'll all have a chance to scroll through the chat screen. I think there might be a question in the Q&A here. Yeah, someone wants to ask, do you have any comment on the sexual identity in the punk scene?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, and I think sometimes we think that punk is very masculine and, very male dominated, but as I saw in my research and as countless participants in punk have always mentioned, that punk was, the beginning of punk has been queer folks, have been people of color, and sexual identity in punk was just anything you want to be. There was men that dress like women, women like dress with men. And I think there was this diminishing of gender identity in punk, where there was folks that joined punk because they felt liberated. There was queer folks that joined punk because they weren't being judged for being queer as an outside dominant culture would happen.
Very good. And then there's another similar question, but I think not so much on sexual orientation as just on gender differences. I've lost it as I scroll through here, but was there a difference between Chicana punk rockers and Chicano punk rockers?
Yeah, definitely. So in the mid 1970s, young Mexican American women began to experience a new sense of cultural pride through the Chicano movement. However, as we see in the Chicana movement, there is kind of this sexism happening, and a lot of women moved out or weren't as organizing, and some of them formed their own cultural movements called the Chicana feminist movement, but others went into punk. And, in punk themselves, a lot of women didn't feel as, would say, regulated by sexism or dominated, because they felt that there was more autonomy. But the difference between men punkeros and women punkeros was that the women really did talk about these gender issues that they were facing at home in punk, as though the men didn't really talk about the sexism they faced in society.
What do you think led to the erasure of Chicana punks and other queer and BIPOC participants?
Black Indigenous people of color. Thank you for that question. That's an excellent one, and this is where the work comes in. Alice Bagg mentions that a lot of this was erased because it wasn't documented. She says that's why women and women of color need to document their histories, because ultimately what we see even in academia is it's not proportioned. We see more white historians, white male historians in it, and that has led to erasure of it. So the history is there, but it's more about uncovering it.
Excellent question, excellent answer. And that's why we need local history programs at our universities and local community-based historical societies as well. One more question here. I'm wondering about your thoughts on backyard pre-COVID, of course, punk rock parties and get-togethers.
Awesome. Yes, pre-COVID, of course. I think this is the hardest thing for musicians now, that we're not able to play our shows and go out. So backyard is DIY. I grew up in South Central. So South Central is known as a very DIY punk shows happening, ska shows happening. And, even as a participant myself of these backyard shows, and I've played countless backyard shows, it's very about the youth just finding a way to escape and finding a way to just question things and feel accepted, because a lot of times it's a lot of these outcasts, but then they unite through music, through punk, and through, just being passionate about something. So I haven't gone to a backyard show in a while, and as an adult, I try not to, because a lot of my students are in those shows now. But I do play more bigger venues now with my band, and I go to support as much as I can locally bands and bands that need the support.
I see one more question in the comments here. Was there a difference of views between Chicana punk rockers throughout the LA area? Did you have different views depending on location?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a great question. So as I mentioned, we had the Hollywood scene, we had the East LA scene, and other scenes started to appear. We had the South Bay scene, just different things. And so most Chicanas belong to the East LA scene and the Hollywood scene, and they were not just staying in their scenes, but they were mixing. But there are different perspectives on it. Alice Bag, as I mentioned, said it was multicultural, it was diversity. But we had another Chicana Ponquera, Teresa Escobar Rubes, that had a different experience and did feel that the white, it was too much white for her in the Hollywood scene, so she would prefer to stay in the East LA scene. So there was some differentiating and different opinions on how they felt. But, you know, I think this is part of understanding and seeing that everyone, we can't categorize Chicana Ponqueras the same, but there was all these overlining experiences.